folks, good day to you, VM Explorer. And in today's session, we're talking about building up a VMware Workstation 17 nested lab. This is part one, goals, requirements, and we're calling it a bit of planning as well. But let's go ahead and get started. So a few viewers saw a previous video that I did around doing a nested VSAN ESA cluster, and they liked it. They liked what I did. It was really short though. They wanted to understand more of the details about how to actually do it, from building up something, building up the workstation, getting it installed, services, all that type of stuff. So what I did was I started out kind of getting an agenda here of 8 different parts of how to actually do these. Now I'm going to try and keep these hopefully right about 15 minutes a piece. They're supposed to be short videos to try to give you an idea of how to get the job done, right? Hopefully get you through it. Today is kind of goals, requirements, and a bit of planning. Yeah, it's probably going to be boring. It's a lot of slides, all right? But I guarantee you the rest of it won't be a lot of slides. Be minimal, be a lot of showing how to do things. This one's important though, because there's a lot of requirements here that you really got to think about before you actually purchase things or do stuff, before you get into it. There's a lot of different things to think about, and that's what this is really, this session is about. These parts may change. I might be able to combine a few. I might not be able to. We'll see how it goes. But for right now, these are the 8 parts I got laid out. All right, so quick note. What you're seeing in these videos and in the sessions are really kind of my knowledge or my insight around using these products. I highly recommend that you do your own research and read the manuals and figure out what works for you. This is what worked for me, right? That's what this series is about. This is just an example for you to kind of look at and say, okay, now I start to understand it better. I should probably go and read the guide and figure it out a little bit more. Oh, Matt missed this part. That's important to me. I need to think about those things, right? So really, this you should really read the manuals and check things out before you get into this. All right, so the agenda for part one. We're going to talk about the overall goals, some of the requirements, and then some of the planning that I go into doing it. Now, not covered in this series, right? It's not meant to be completely comprehensive, right? Again, do your own research. Just like you're watching this video is considered part of your research, reading the manual, etc., right? Things that are not covered also, Workstation for Linux, Fusion for Mac, or considerations for AMD CPUs. Now, I'm sorry, my system's built on Intel. If you're interested in AMD, just look it up in the manual. You'll find a lot of those items there around Workstation especially, okay? Okay, so overall goal. My overall goal is to build a nested vSphere 8, VSAN 8 ESA cluster on Workstation 17. Now, VSAN ESA is VMware's new technology, right? You can consider it like the enhanced or the extreme, right? style performance. It's a very robust, performant version of ESA. Now, you might hear folks call OSA, original storage architecture, right? And that's the old vSAN that we've known and loved for many generations. It's still around and out there. This one is just enhanced. And I wanted to do it nested to just try to see, how does it perform? What does it look like? I have no experience with it. So I thought I would try it in a nested cluster first, all right? Underlying OS is Windows 11. Nested VMs are going to be 3 ESXi version 8 U1 hosts, VCSA 8, and 1 Windows 2022 server. We'll talk about those here coming up. Networking is all private, right? So any communications between things all happens on the workstation network. Again, we'll explain that going more forward. It should be able to run VMs on the nested hosts. So you've got workstation, then you've got these ESXi hosts, then on top of them, you want to run VMs. So it should be able to run, VMs as well. And then nested environment should perform smoothly, right? I should give the underlying hardware enough resources to be able to support this load. And that's part of the planning process that we're going to run into here real soon. So visually, this is kind of what it looks like, right? We've got the physical hardware layer, which is by Workstation PC. On that, I've installed Windows 11. On top of that, I've installed Workstation 17 Pro. Once that's established, then I create VMs. So I'll start with my Windows 2022 VM, which is my Active Directory controller, my VCSA 8 VM, right? I'll create that on Workstation. And then the 3 ESXi hosts. Now, you may notice that the ESXi hosts and the VCSA and Windows are all about the same color of blue. I did that to represent that they're running their VMs, but they're running on Workstation. But if you go a step above that and you see HCI Bench, HCI Bench is a VSAN performance benchmarking tool. We use it to kind of benchmark systems. HCI Bench and several other VMs are kind of a purplish color. That indicates that they're running actually on the nested ESXi hosts. And then, of course, we have a connection to the internet, and that's provided through the Windows 2022 server via their RAS service. All right, so some of the requirements to think about for Workstation and Windows 11. Okay, you're going to need a 64-bit CPU. They also support AMD. Should look that up, right? This is the number one mistake most folks bet is they have a system, they go to try to install Workstation, and they don't have a compatible CPU. So it's important to look at those particular specs, right? Make sure that you have the properly supported CPU. The host PC should have at least 2 gigs of RAM. 4 is recommended. A display adapter of some type. And then different drives, you know, IDE, SATA, SCSI, NVMe, someplace to run the VMs. Check out this KB article here for supported OS types. That's a good article to check out. And then any controller, this is any Ethernet controller that supports the host OS is supported in Workstation. So if you've got Windows 11 and you got an Intel NIC and Windows 11 supports it, then Workstation Pro is going to support it. Not a problem. Okay. For Windows 11, again, an x64 CPU underneath, which kind of matches what Workstation was telling you. 4 gigs of RAM, 64 gig of disk to actually install. You can see on the CPU specs, they're recommending, a 2.5 gigahertz, 4-core, probably kind of at a minimum, right? DirectX compatibility, et cetera, for this. Now, one of the tips on Windows 11 compatibility tool, you can use that to check to see if your PC meets the requirements to install 11. 11 is a little bit more tricky. You might run that tool to actually check it out and see if it's going to work for you. Okay, requirements for ESXi, VSAN, etc. Now we're doing this to kind of set the stage, right? These are the minimum requirements to think about when we just get started. We're going to talk about the actual requirements that I've done to build out my systems, but for now these are kind of the minimums, right? So ESXi host is a 64-bit 2-core CPU, 8 gigs of RAM, VTX enabled, etc. Minimum 32 gig hard disk. So if I were going to build a nested ESXi host, that would be the minimum I would build it to, right? When I do the install, I could choose 2 cores and 8 gigs of RAM. I'd enable the VTXD and a minimum of 32 gig hard disk to get started. ESA, VCN ESA requires, right? Soft requirements, that is, 25 gig networking. Now that's what's recommended, right? In a physical home lab or something, you might have difficulty supporting that now because that's a really fast speed, but it needs it because it's all flash environment. It needs 4 NVMe disks per host, 512 gigs of RAM. That's quite a bit. So if we're thinking about doing nesting, we're like, wow, that's huge. That's a lot. Can I do it? And the answer is yes, you can do it with a lot less. It just won't be as performant. Can you do it in production? Absolutely not. This is a non-production environment, right? We're talking about here. Windows 2022 Active Directory, the VM that I created. So it requires a minimum 64-bit processor. You can see the gigahertz there, 2 gig RAM, 32 gig hard disk. VCSA, which is our management server for the ESXi hosts. For a tiny install, which is appropriate for this, 2 vCPUs, 14 gigs of RAM, and a hard disk space of 580 gig, give or take. Okay. Now, here's what gets interesting. HCI Bench is a tool that I use to check out my systems. Now, it requires 8 vCPU, and it's highlighted and underlined there because in designing things out, you really got to think about what you want to run and their requirements. If I build up a host with only 2 cores, I can't install HCI Bench because it has a requirement for 8 vCPU. It won't install. I need to have an underlying host of at least 8 CPUs for it to install. Right now, going down this list, it's the big one on the list that I need to align to. So in my planning process, I really need to take that hard disk size, memory, all those types of things into consideration. One thing I'd also suggest is check out my home lab guide on my blog. There's a lot more details on planning and processing and things of that nature. All right, so planning tips. Choose that CPU that supports workstation software. That's the number one failure I see on blog posts and Reddit and Facebook groups. Everyone's like trying to install it and it doesn't install because their processor doesn't support VTXD or the AMD, whatever it is, virtualization trigger, right? So do your homework. Make sure your CPU supports that even before you install Workstation. Choose a CPU that has enough P cores to support the ESXi VM's features and their VMs appropriately. That's what we talked about earlier. That HCI bench is a real good example. 8 cores minimum, right? I got to have 8 cores on my nested host. And then number 3 on this list is a pretty important one. One of the tips is, really use SSD, NVMe, or U.2 versus spinning disks. And if you're using hard disks, spinning disks, use one hard disk per VM deployment. But highly recommend the latter. Go with SSD, NVMe, and U2 spinning disks versus spinning disks, right? You're going to be a lot happier. It's going to perform better, and you're going to have a better experience all over. Use private networks. They work best for workstation versus internal integration or external integration, right? And it's because they internally talk to one another via the processor. There's no going out to the physical network to actually, communicate. So they'll actually work a lot faster for sure. And the beauty of Workstation, is you can afford to make mistakes and correct them easily. Now, the hardware might be a really big mistake, but if you make a software mistake, that's the beauty of it. You can just wipe it out, start it over, and go from there. All right, so this is the network diagram, what we're talking about. So we have the 3 underlying ESA hosts down below, ESA 1, 2, and 3. They have Optane disks right there. And then above, we have the different networking stacks. So we've got the FT vMotion replication network that I set up, an ESA network that is used for the backbone for the servers to communicate for VSAN ESA, and then the management network where the VMs actually run and communicate. Again, the different colorations, right? The blue indicates VMs that are running on Workstation. Purple indicates VMs that are running on the actual ESA or ESXi hosts. Now, if you notice the AD server there, I also use it to allow my systems to communicate to the internet. So when you're typically setting up a system, it's actually for that gateway, right? Or the route of last resort. I point all of that to my AD server, the 10.222 server. And then I basically multi-home it with a different network and set up RAS, remote access server, to allow it to be kind of NATed to the internet. So all these systems can route to it, they can get to the internet, and they can get back out and they get what they need. All right, so planning CPU cores. Now, I'm a little fortunate because my physical hardware has 24 cores, and man, does it use it, right? And 48 with hyperthread, if you consider hyperthreading cores. I typically stay with physical cores, right? So 24 physical cores, right? And as we move up the stack, I set up each host with 8 cores of 8 cores each, right? For the ESXi host, 2, as you can see, for the VCSA, 2 for the Windows server. And then, as you can see above, the HCI bench and its worker nodes can use a range between 8 and 2 vCPUs. So that's something to think about when you're planning this out. So if I got 3 ESXi hosts, right, they took a total of 24 cores, and they got another 4 cores using for VCSA and Windows. Well, shoot, now I'm at, what do we got, 24, 28 cores, and only have 24 physical below. That's the beauty of virtualization. You can oversubscribe things, right? They're not in use all the time. And when I'm actually running these tests and things, I'm usually running about 40 or 50%. In fact, as I'm recording this video, this lab is actually running in the background right now. As I'm recording this video, that's how performant the physical hardware I have is set up. All right, so let's look at the nested nodes. This is how I set them up. I gave each one 107 or 110 gigs of RAM. It comes out to 107, 8 processors. You can see the hard disk layout there. That's important, right? 142 gig for boot. And then the 4 290 gig drives below it, which are all NVMe, right? These are all Optane disks, so high-speed Optane disk. Each host has its own 2 terabyte or terabyte and a half Optane disk, right? And then basically I kind of divided it up, made these disks here, these virtual disks, 290 a piece. I then set up 6 network adapters and broke those up into the 3 core networks. So the management network, as an example, I got a primary and a secondary, failover type of thing in case I want to test that. Same with the fault tolerant and replication, and then also the VSAN network. It's got redundancy here, kind of running it as based on NIC load, right? Kind of redundancy. Okay. Planning on the VMs and workstations. So we have the VCSA, right? And the Active Directory controller. The VCSA installs as is. This is the tiny setup. There's nothing really to adjust. You just need to make sure you get it on the right network adapter. Okay, it's pretty easy. The Active Directory controller for with Windows 2022. No big deal. Just use the standard settings. I went with 8 gigs and 2 processors and 60 gigs of RAM, and then the network setup, as you can see. Pretty simple. All right. HCI bench. Again, this is one of the ones that take a lot of resources off our nested hosts. Again, it is an 8 vCPU, 8 gigs of RAM to run the benchmark, and then the worker nodes, which are the little guys over here, these 4, it's going to run 4 per host when it does its setup. Now, it can run less, it can run more, depends on the settings, but the default easy kind of settings for HCI bench install 4 VMs per host. Those VMs, as you can see, they take up 4 CPUs each, right? 8 gigs of RAM each as well. So if you think about it, each host is going to have to support a total of 16 vCPU and 32 gig of RAM to actually execute HCI bench. All right, here's the quick summary. So I took all that information and kind of got it back. Now, why are we looking at this? We're looking at this because we're trying to figure out, how much am I going to need physically to do this? Yeah, there's oversubscription, right? I can provision 500 gigs of RAM and only have 64 gig below. Sure, you can do crazy things like that, right? But how is the system going to perform? That's really where you're kind of trying to ballpark this stuff, right? I'm fortunate enough to have a really performant system underneath. It can handle all this load, but it's something you might want to think about when you're trying to set up your host trying to do this, right? Remember this ESXi settings for VSAN ESA. I mean, the minimum per host was 512 gigs of RAM. I mean, that's a lot of memory. I only have maybe 110 I can spare out of the 384 per host. And it seemed to perform well enough and smooth enough to actually be usable, right? And actually I could learn from it. That's the whole point of doing Nested Workstation, is trying to learn from it and it not be so laggy. This setup seemed to work pretty good for me as far as these particular specs. All right, so let's look at the hardware choices. So again, we've got the my setup on the left, and I kind of put an optional setup here. Maybe you don't have as much completely untested, but something you might want to think about. I know my system's it's crazy off the hook, right? It's got a lot of goodness in it, but it runs like a top. It runs great. I've been very happy with it. So Windows 11 Pro for Workstation 17 Pro is a software. The motherboard's an AS Rock Rack. You can see the model number there, that EPC 621. It has a Xeon Gold 6252 processor. You might notice that there's actually an ES here. ES stands for engineering samples, right? So it's a lower cost processor that sometimes you can find on eBay and things like that. I've had good luck with them. It's been running in my system for quite a while. Zero issues. It's just rocking. 384 gigs of RAM. This motherboard really can support a lot of memory. It can also support the Optane P memory as well. So if you ever consider that, that might be an option if you're into those types of things. And then going down, plenty of storage here, right? So NVMe, 2 terabyte rocket disks. I use those for the Active Directory controller and my VCSA. Run off of those. But the U2 drives, right? So in this particular physical setup, I have 3 Optane disks that are 1.5 each. Each one of those disks is responsible for running one ESXi host. The Optane disks are fabulously fast, right? They're crazy performant, and they work great. So I kind of separated things out. I didn't want to have everything on one drive. And that's really kind of the rule of thumb with Workstation is you should really think about the disk. Disk is probably the number one bottleneck that most people run into is they choose spinning disks and they put a lot of VMs on a spinning disk and it doesn't perform well. Well, your spinning disk is only going to give you maybe 100, maybe 120 IOPS. Super slow compared to flash devices, right? Like SSD disks or NVMe, whatever it might be, or the U.2 Optane disks. They're crazy fast, like 50,000 IOPS or something crazy like that, right? They just fly. So they're going to work much better for Workstation when it makes those calls. For video, I have a GTX 1650 Super. It's been a great card. I don't do a lot of gaming, but it works really well for video capture and everything I do with it. And then some network adapters here. Another option, like I said, if you kind of look into the right, you might look at these different options here. This could be an example of something you might try that might be able to run very similar, right? I think you might run into a little bit of issues with the RAM. It depends on how you divide it up and how much you use. When I was in use with my 3 ESXi hosts running HCI bench, I think about 40 or 50% of the CPU was used. A good chunk of the RAM is pushing probably about maybe 40, 50% as well. All right, so licensing. This is something to really think about. You want to do this, and that's great, but do you have the licenses for it? Right? So the ESXi hosts and VSAN and VCSA, most of those are free for 60 days, so you can play around with them there. You might also consider VMUG Advantage. In fact, they have a sale going on right now for another week or two where they've discounted their VMUG Advantage. VMUG Advantage is a way that you can get keys for a year for a very low cost, and usually it's less than $200 per year to join VMUG Advantage. There's also discounts on training and things of that way. In fact, if you're going to a VMware training class, I would get VMUG Advantage because they give you a phenomenal discount on training that'll more than pay you back from that $200. Plus, there's a lot of other benefits. So I would check out VMUG Advantage. For Windows 2022, Visual Studio seems to work pretty good for the keys there, especially for home lab use. And if you're interested in more ideas around licenses or things like that, check out that QR code there for different ideas. But hey, you're in the way of the QR code. Okay, I'll get out of the way, give you guys a chance to scan it real quick, and then we'll get back on with the session. Thanks. Around that. All right, I'll include a few links that I've talked about here in this session. We're wrapping it up in the description in case you have any questions. And that's it. So that's the start of it. We're going to go ahead and get it started. Coming up soon is part 2. We're going to be doing the software install, the setup of Windows 11 and Workstation 17. There's a few gotchas there you really got to think about, especially with Windows 11 installation. So thank you very much, everybody. I do hope that you have a great day. Take care.